Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin in the most impossible places. Deep beneath the earth where sunlight never reaches and hope seems buried forever, two souls found each other in the darkness. This is not a fairy tale. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about Maria Santos and David Chen, a story of survival, forbidden love, and a desperate escape that would either save them both or destroy everything they had left to live for. In 1987, in the remote copper mines of northern Chile, where workers disappeared without questions asked and women were traded like property, an arranged marriage became the spark that ignited a revolution. What started as a routine forced ceremony in the depths of a mine shaft became a heart-stopping race against time, collapsing tunnels, and men who would kill to keep their secrets buried. You think you know what desperation looks like? You think you understand the lengths people will go to for freedom? This story will test every assumption you have about human courage, love under impossible circumstances, and what happens when ordinary people are pushed far beyond their breaking point. The mine cart is already shaking. The supports are groaning, and somewhere in the darkness, a man's voice echoes with words that will either mean salvation or certain death. Grab everything you can. We're leaving now. This is their story. This is what really happened. Maria Santos pressed her back against the cold, wet stone wall of the mine shaft, listening to the heavy footsteps echoing through the tunnels above. The white dress they had forced her to wear was already stained with mud and coal dust, a mockery of what a wedding dress should represent. In 6 hours, she would be married to Carlos Mendoza, the mine foreman's son, in a ceremony that would take place 300 feet underground, where no authorities could interfere and no witnesses could escape to tell the tale. She had arrived at the Esperanza copper mine 3 weeks ago, sold by her own father to pay off gambling debts that had spiraled completely out of control. The transaction was simple and brutal. Her father owed Miguel Mendoza 50,000 pesos, money he would never be able to repay working his small farm. Miguel needed a wife for his son Carlos, a violent man whose reputation had made it impossible to find a willing bride in any of the surrounding villages. The deal was struck over cheap whiskey in a cantina, and Maria's life was signed away on a napkin. The mine itself was a nightmare that stretched deep into the Chilean mountains. Originally dug by a legitimate mining company in the 1960s, it had been abandoned when copper prices crashed in the early 1980s. Miguel Mendoza and his crew of 23 men had taken it over, operating an illegal mining operation that produced just enough copper to fund their real business, human trafficking, drug running, and serving as a hideout for criminals fleeing justice from 3 different countries. The underground complex had been expanded far beyond its original design. Miles of tunnels connected, living quarters, storage areas, a makeshift kitchen, and even a small chapel carved directly into the rock where forced marriages were conducted away from any legal oversight. The men lived like moles, emerging only at night to conduct their business in the outside world. For the women brought here against their will, there was no outside world. There was only the endless darkness and the constant sound of dripping water echoing through stone corridors. Maria had spent her first week in a small cell, barely large enough to lie down, while Miguel's wife Rosa prepared her for the wedding. Rosa was a broken woman who had once been in Maria's exact position, married to Miguel 15 years earlier when she was just 19. The years underground had drained all the life from her eyes, and she moved through her daily routines like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, and never making eye contact with any of the men. "You will learn to accept this," Rosa had whispered to Maria while helping her into the wedding dress. "Fighting only makes it worse. Carlos has a temper, but if you do what he says and don't cause trouble, you might survive long enough to see your children grow up down here." Children. The word made Maria's stomach turn. She had watched Carlos from a distance during her time in the mine, seen how he treated the other women who lived in this underground hell. There were 5 women in total, all wives of the men who ran this operation. They lived in constant fear, bearing children who would never see sunlight, raising them in a world where violence was the only law and escape was impossible. The mine's security was designed by people who understood exactly what they were protecting. The main entrance was hidden behind a false rock wall that could only be opened from the inside. The ventilation shafts were too narrow for an adult to climb through, and they were fitted with metal grates that were welded shut. Every tunnel had multiple choke points where armed guards could stop any escape attempt, and the entire complex was rigged with explosives that Miguel could detonate if authorities ever discovered their location. But Maria Santos was not like the other women who had been brought here. She had grown up on a farm, working alongside her brothers until they left for the city. She knew how to handle tools, how to read the signs of structural weakness in old buildings, and most importantly, She knew how to wait for the right opportunity. During her 3 weeks underground, she had been studying every detail of the mine's layout, memorizing the guard rotations and identifying the weak points in their security system. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock at night, when most of the men would be drunk on the cheap wine Miguel had been saving for the occasion. Carlos would be expected to consummate the marriage immediately afterward, which meant Maria had maybe 6 hours of relative freedom before her situation became infinitely worse. As she sat in her cell, still wearing the stained wedding dress, Maria heard someone approaching through the tunnel. The footsteps were different from the heavy boots of the miners, lighter, more careful. She looked up to see a man she had never noticed before, carrying a plate of food and a small cup of water. David Chen was 28 years old, the son of Chinese immigrants who had come to Chile in the 1950s. He was thin and quiet, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Unlike the other men in the mine, he carried no weapons and spoke softly to the women when he brought them their meals. Maria had assumed he was just another criminal hiding underground, but as he set down her food and water, she noticed something that changed everything. His hands were covered in small, precise scars, the kind that came from working with delicate electronics, not mining equipment. When he moved, she could see a small tattoo on his wrist that looked like a radio frequency symbol. And most importantly, when he thought no one was watching, his eyes were constantly moving toward the ceiling, as if he was listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. "The ceremony starts in 6 hours," he said quietly, crouching down so they were at eye level. "Miguel has been drinking since noon. Carlos is already so drunk he can barely stand. The guards think this is just a party." Maria stared at him, trying to understand why he was telling her this. "What does that matter? I'll still be trapped down here tomorrow morning." David looked around to make sure they were alone, then leaned closer. "What if I told you that in exactly 5 hours and 43 minutes, there's going to be a massive earthquake that will collapse half of these tunnels? And what if I told you that I've been planning an escape route that uses that earthquake as cover?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maria felt her heart begin to race. But she forced herself to remain calm. "How could you possibly know when an earthquake is going to happen?" "Because I'm not a criminal hiding underground," David whispered. "I'm a seismologist working for the Chilean government, and I've been monitoring this area for 3 months. The tectonic activity has been building toward a major event, and according to my calculations, it's going to happen tonight. Miguel and his men have no idea they built their operation directly on top of an active fault line." Maria's mind raced as she processed this information. "If you're working for the government, why haven't you called for help? Why haven't you reported this place?" David's expression darkened. "Because Miguel has connections in the police, the military, and the government. 3 times I've tried to get word out, and 3 times my contacts have disappeared. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine. If we're getting out of here alive, we're doing it on our own." The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, and David quickly stood up, resuming his role as just another mine worker bringing food to a prisoner. But before he walked away, he dropped something small and metal next to Maria's plate, a handmade key that would fit the lock on her cell. "When you hear the ground start to shake," he whispered, "count to 30 and then unlock your door. I'll be waiting at the intersection near the chapel. Bring nothing except what you can carry in your pockets. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before they realize what's happening." As David disappeared back into the darkness of the tunnels, Maria picked up the key and felt its weight in her palm. For the first time since arriving at the mine, she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. The next 5 hours passed like a lifetime. Maria could hear the sounds of preparation echoing through the mine, men laughing and drinking, Rosa setting up decorations in the chapel, Carlos practicing his wedding vows in a voice that got louder and more slurred with each repetition. The normal routine of the mine continued around the celebration, with guards maintaining their posts and workers continuing their shifts in the deeper tunnels. But Maria was no longer thinking about the wedding or what would happen afterward. She was thinking about fault lines and structural collapse, about the weight of 300 feet of rock above their heads, and about whether David Chen was telling her the truth or leading her into an even worse trap. At 9:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, the earth moved. It started as a low rumble that could have been mistaken for heavy machinery, but Maria felt it in her bones, the deep, rolling vibration that meant the mountain itself was shifting. She grabbed the key David had given her and waited, counting the seconds as the rumbling grew stronger. The men in the tunnels began to shout, but their voices were confused, not panicked. They had felt minor tremors before and didn't yet understand that this was different. Maria heard Carlos cursing as he stumbled toward the chapel, probably thinking the noise was just another part of life in an old mine. At exactly 30 seconds, just as David had instructed, Maria unlocked her cell door and stepped into the tunnel. The rumbling was getting stronger now, and she could hear small pieces of rock beginning to fall from the ceiling. Emergency lights flickered on throughout the complex as the mine's electrical system strained under the seismic stress. She made her way carefully through the tunnels toward the chapel, staying close to the walls and avoiding the main pathways where panicked men were starting to run back and forth. The layout she had memorized during her 3 weeks underground guided her through the darkness, but everything felt different now. The tunnels seemed to be shifting slightly, and the familiar landmarks were harder to recognize in the chaos. When she reached the intersection near the chapel, David was already waiting, carrying a small backpack and holding what looked like a professional seismic monitoring device. His face was grim but determined, and when he saw her, he nodded toward a tunnel she had never explored before. "This leads to an old emergency exit that was sealed during the original construction," he explained quickly. "The earthquake should crack the seal enough for us to break through, but we need to move fast. The main collapse is going to happen in the next 8 to 10 minutes. As if to emphasize his point, a deep crack appeared in the wall beside them, and dust began to rain down from the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, Miguel was screaming orders at his men. Trying to organize some kind of response to what they still didn't understand was a natural disaster. Maria looked back toward the chapel one last time, thinking about Rosa and the other women who would be trapped when the mine collapsed. What about the others? We can't just leave them. David's face was filled with pain, but his voice was firm. If we try to save everyone, we'll save no one. Rosa knows these tunnels better than anyone. She'll find her own way out if it's possible. But Maria, we have maybe 7 minutes before this entire section comes down. It's now or never." The rumbling beneath their feet was getting stronger, and they could hear the sound of major structural supports beginning to fail deeper in the mine. Maria took a deep breath, grabbed David's hand, and followed him into the darkness of the unknown tunnel. Behind them, the chapel where she was supposed to have been married began to fill with the sound of screaming men and falling rock. The forced wedding was over before it had even begun. But their real test was just beginning. The tunnel David led her through was older than the rest of the mine, carved by the original company with different tools and different safety standards. The walls were rougher, the ceiling lower, and every step echoed with the sound of their labored breathing and the growing earthquake above them. "How do you know this tunnel leads to the surface?" Maria asked as they stumbled through the darkness. "I don't," David replied honestly. "But the seismic data shows that this section of the mine was built on stable bedrock. If there's any part of this complex that will survive the next few minutes, it's this tunnel." As they reached the end of the passageway, they found exactly what David had predicted. A concrete wall with an old emergency exit sign, cracked down the middle from the seismic activity. Beyond the crack, they could see a faint hint of starlight. Freedom was less than 3 feet away, but first they had to break through a concrete barrier, while an earthquake brought down a mountain around them. David dropped his backpack and pulled out a small sledgehammer that he had somehow managed to smuggle through the mine without anyone noticing. The concrete wall was old and already weakened by decades of water damage, but it was still thick enough to stop them if they couldn't break through quickly. "Stand back," he told Maria, and began attacking the crack with precise, powerful blows. Each impact sent vibrations through the tunnel that mixed with the ongoing earthquake, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Behind them, the sounds from the main mine complex were getting worse. They could hear Miguel screaming orders at his men, trying to organize an evacuation that was probably already too late. The electrical system was failing section by section, leaving most of the tunnels in complete darkness. And underneath it all was the continuous growing rumble of millions of tons of rock settling into new positions as the earthquake reshaped the mountain. "How long have you been planning this?" Maria asked, helping David by pulling away chunks of concrete as he loosened them. 3 months, he replied between hammer blows. "Ever since I identified this location as the epicenter of increasing seismic activity, the government sent me here to study earthquake patterns, but when I discovered what Miguel was really doing, everything changed. The crack in the wall was getting bigger, but it was still not large enough for a person to squeeze through." David paused to wipe sweat from his face, and Maria could see that his hands were bleeding from gripping the hammer so tightly. "I tried to work within the system," he continued. "I filed reports, contacted my supervisors, even reached out to international human rights organizations. But Miguel has been running this operation for 5 years, and he's built a network of corruption that reaches into every level of law enforcement. Every time I thought I had found someone who could help, my contacts would either disappear or suddenly become very interested in transferring me to a different assignment. Another massive tremor shook the tunnel, and a section of the ceiling, about 20 feet behind them, collapsed completely, sealing off their route back to the main mine. They were committed now. The only way out was forward, through the concrete wall and whatever lay beyond it. "So you decided to cause an earthquake?" Maria asked, only half joking. David actually smiled at that, even as he continued hammering at the wall. "I can predict earthquakes, not cause them. But when the seismic data showed that a major event was building in this area, I realized it might be the only opportunity to escape that we would ever get. Miguel built this place to be impregnable from the outside, but he never considered what would happen if the mountain itself turned against him. The opening was finally large enough for them to squeeze through, but just as David was preparing to go first, they heard something that stopped them both cold. Footsteps running through the tunnel behind them, accompanied by the harsh voice of Carlos Mendoza screaming Maria's name. "You think you can run from me?" Carlos shouted, his words echoing off the stone walls. "You think this earthquake changes anything? I'll drag you back to that chapel if I have to carry you over my own father's dead body." David and Maria looked at each other, in the dim light filtering through the crack in the wall. Carlos was drunk, angry, and probably armed, but more importantly, he knew these tunnels just as well as they did. If they tried to escape through the opening now, he would be right behind them. "Go," David whispered to Maria. "I'll handle Carlos." "No," Maria replied firmly. "We go together or we don't go at all." The footsteps were getting closer, and they could hear Carlos stumbling over debris from the partial collapse, cursing and threatening as he fought his way through the damaged tunnel. In just a few more seconds, he would round the corner and see them at the emergency exit. David made a quick decision. He pulled a small device from his backpack that looked like a radio, but when he flipped a switch on the side, it began emitting a high-pitched whine that grew louder and more intense with each second. "What is that?" Maria asked. "Seismic resonance amplifier," David explained quickly. "It's designed to measure earthquake intensity, but if you reverse the polarity and amp up the frequency, it can trigger small localized collapses in already weakened structures." He pointed the device back toward the tunnel where Carlos was approaching and increased the frequency. The whining sound became almost unbearable, and Maria could feel it vibrating in her teeth. Then, with a crack like thunder, a 20-foot section of the tunnel ceiling came down exactly where Carlos would have been standing. The screaming stopped. They waited in silence for 30 seconds, listening for any sign that Carlos had survived the collapse, but there was nothing except the ongoing earthquake and the sound of their own heavy breathing. "Is he dead?" Maria asked quietly. "I don't know," David admitted, "but if he's alive, he's trapped on the other side of about 10 tons of rock. Either way, we need to move now." David went through the opening first, using his flashlight to check what lay beyond the concrete wall. What he found was better than they had dared to hope: a natural cave that connected to the emergency exit tunnel, leading upward toward the surface. The cave was part of the original geological formation that the miners had encountered when they first dug the complex, and it had been sealed off for safety reasons rather than because it was dangerous. Maria squeezed through the opening after him, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she breathed air that didn't smell like diesel fumes and human desperation. The cave was narrow and steep, but it was clearly leading upward, and there was a faint breeze that carried the scent of pine trees and open sky. They climbed in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, using David's flashlight to navigate around loose rocks and avoid stepping into crevices that could break an ankle. Behind them, the sounds of the earthquake and the collapsing mine grew fainter, but they could still feel vibrations through the rock that reminded them how much mountain was still hanging over their heads. "Tell me about yourself," David said as they climbed, partly to keep their minds off the danger, and partly because he realized he was risking his life for a woman he barely knew. "Before all this, what was your life like?" Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that question. "I grew up on a farm about 200 kilometers from here. My mother died when I was 12, so I helped raise my 3 younger brothers while my father worked the land. It was hard work, but it was good work. We grew potatoes and corn, raised some chickens, had a few goats. Nothing fancy, but we always had enough to eat." She paused to catch her breath as they climbed over a particularly steep section of rock. "My brothers all left for Santiago when they turned 18, looking for better opportunities in the city. They send money home when they can, but it's not enough to keep the farm going. When my father's gambling debts got out of control, selling me to Miguel was the only option he could think of." "Do you hate him for it?" David asked. "I should," Maria replied. But mostly, I just feel sorry for him. He's a weak man who made weak choices, and now he has to live with the knowledge that he traded his only daughter to pay for his own mistakes. That's probably punishment enough. They reached a section of the cave where the ceiling was higher and the path leveled out slightly. David stopped to check his seismic equipment, and the readings showed that they were now far enough from the fault line to be safe from the worst of the earthquake damage. "What about you?" Maria asked. "What made a government seismologist decide to become a one-man rescue operation?" David was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Maria hadn't heard before. "My younger sister disappeared 3 years ago while she was studying at university in Valparaiso. The police said she probably just ran away with some boyfriend, but I knew that wasn't true. She was too smart, too careful, too connected to our family to just vanish without a word." He started climbing again, and Maria followed, listening to his story as they continued toward the surface. "I spent 2 years searching for her, following leads that went nowhere, bribing officials who took my money and gave me nothing in return. Then, 6 months ago, I finally found someone who told me the truth. She had been kidnapped by human traffickers and sold to men who operate illegal mining operations in remote areas. By the time I found out, she was already dead." Maria felt her heart sink as she understood the real reason David had risked everything to help her. "You think she was in a place like Miguel's mine?" "I know she was," David replied. "The man who told me what happened to her described conditions that were identical to what I found in the Esperanza mine. Women kept as slaves, forced marriages, children born in darkness who never see the outside world. When I was assigned to study seismic activity in this area and discovered what Miguel was really doing, I knew I couldn't just file a report and walk away." They had been climbing for almost an hour when David's flashlight began to flicker. The batteries were dying and they had no backup source of light. But just as Maria was starting to worry about navigating the rest of the cave in complete darkness, she saw something that made her heart leap with hope. A faint glow coming from somewhere ahead of them. "Is that sunlight?" she asked. "No," David replied, checking his watch. "It's almost midnight. That's moonlight." They climbed faster now, energized by the promise of escape that was so close they could almost touch it. The cave opened up into a larger chamber, and at the far end they could see a narrow opening that led to the outside world. Through the opening, they could see stars and the silhouette of pine trees against the night sky. But just as they were preparing to squeeze through the final opening, they heard something that stopped them dead in their tracks, the sound of vehicles approaching, and voices shouting orders in Spanish. "Miguel," David whispered. "He made it out of the mine." Through the opening, they could see flashlights and headlights moving around what appeared to be a camp or staging area. Miguel had obviously prepared for the possibility that his underground operation might be compromised, and he had an escape plan that brought him to this exact location. "How did he know we would come this way?" Maria asked. "He probably didn't," David replied grimly. "This is probably just his backup headquarters, the place he planned to regroup if anything went wrong with the mine. Our escape route just happens to lead directly to his emergency camp." They were trapped between the collapsed mine behind them and Miguel's armed men in front of them. The earthquake had saved them from forced marriage and slavery, but it had also delivered them directly into the hands of the man who had created their nightmare in the first place. Outside, they could hear Miguel giving orders to his men, organizing search parties to look for survivors from the mine. It was only a matter of time before someone discovered the cave opening and found them hiding just a few feet away. "We need a plan," Maria whispered. "I'm working on it," David replied, but his voice carried a tone that suggested their options were very limited. The voices outside were getting louder, and they could hear men spreading out to search the area around the cave opening. Maria and David pressed themselves against the wall of the chamber, trying to stay hidden in the shadows, but they both knew that discovery was inevitable. That's when Maria heard something that changed everything. The sound of a minecart rattling over rough tracks, coming from somewhere outside the cave. Miguel hadn't just established a backup camp at this location, he had built another mining operation, probably smaller and more hidden than the one that had just collapsed. And where there was a minecart, there was a rail line that led somewhere else. Possibly somewhere far from Miguel and his men. "David," she whispered, "I think I have an idea." Maria's plan was simple and completely insane. The minecart they could hear rattling through the night was part of a rail system that Miguel used to transport materials between his various operations scattered throughout the mountains. If they could reach that rail line without being detected, they might be able to follow it to safety, or at least to a location far enough away from Miguel's immediate reach to give them time to formulate a better plan. The problem was that getting to the rail line meant leaving the cave and crossing about 50 yards of open ground, while armed men with flashlights were actively searching for survivors from the collapsed mine. It would require perfect timing, complete silence, and more luck than any rational person had a right to expect. "You want us to steal a minecart?" David whispered, staring at Maria as if she had suggested they try to fly to the moon. "Not steal it," Maria replied. "Just borrow it for a few hours. Look, those men outside don't know we escaped from the main mine. As far as they're concerned, we're either dead under a pile of rock or trapped somewhere in the tunnels. They're not specifically looking for us, they're just doing a general search of the area." David listened to the voices outside, trying to gauge how many men Miguel had with him and how organized their search was. It sounded like maybe 6 or 7 men spread out over a fairly large area. They were being methodical but not particularly careful, probably assuming that anyone who had escaped the mine collapse would be too injured or disoriented to pose any real threat. "Even if we reach the rail line," David said, "we don't know where it goes. It could lead directly to another one of Miguel's operations, or it could dead-end at some remote location, where we'll be stranded without food, water, or shelter." "Do you have a better idea?" Maria asked. "Because sitting in this cave waiting for them to find us doesn't seem like much of a plan either." David had to admit she was right. They were trapped between certain capture if they stayed and probable death if they tried to escape, but at least escape offered some possibility of survival. He checked his seismic equipment one more time and found that the earthquake activity had mostly subsided. The immediate geological danger was over, which meant their biggest threat now was human rather than natural. They waited until the search party moved to the far side of their camp, then squeezed through the cave opening into the cool night air. The freedom was intoxicating after weeks underground, but they couldn't afford to enjoy it. They had maybe 10 minutes before the searchers worked their way back to this section of the area. The rail line was visible in the moonlight, a narrow-gauge track that disappeared into the darkness in both directions. The minecart was about 100 yards away, sitting motionless on a slight downward grade. It was smaller than the carts used in the main mine, designed more for speed than capacity, which was exactly what they needed. They moved carefully across the rough ground, staying low and freezing whenever they heard voices nearby. The men searching for them were being loud and careless, which worked in Maria and David's favor, but also suggested they were armed and confident. If they were discovered, there would be no opportunity to talk their way out of the situation. When they reached the rail line, David examined the track and the cart while Maria kept watch for approaching searchers. The cart was simple but well maintained, with a basic brake system and what appeared to be a manual steering mechanism. More importantly, it was positioned on a downward slope that would allow them to build up speed quickly without making noise. "This track leads northeast," David whispered, checking his compass. "That should take us toward the main highway, maybe 15 or 20 kilometers from here." "Should take us," Maria repeated. "You mean you don't know for sure?" "I mean I've never stolen a minecart in the middle of the night while being hunted by criminals," David replied. "This is all new territory for me too." They climbed into the cart just as they heard Miguel's voice cutting through the night air, much closer than before. He was angry, shouting at his men for not finding any survivors yet, and his words carried a tone of desperation that suggested he understood how much the loss of his main operation was going to cost him. "Someone survived that collapse," Miguel was yelling. "People don't just disappear without a trace. I want every cave, every crevice, every hiding spot searched until we find them. And when we do find them, I want them alive so they can tell me exactly what happened down there." David released the brake on the minecart and they began to roll slowly down the track, picking up speed gradually as the slope increased. The rails were old but solid, and the cart moved with surprising smoothness despite its basic construction. Within minutes they were traveling fast enough that the camp behind them was just a cluster of dim lights in the distance. But their relief was short-lived. As they rounded a curve in the track, they discovered that Miguel's operation was much larger than they had realized. Ahead of them, built into a natural valley between 2 hills, was another mining complex, complete with buildings, equipment, and dozens of men working night shifts. They were rolling directly toward another one of Miguel's strongholds, and they had no way to stop or change direction without alerting everyone to their presence. "We can't go back," David said, checking behind them. "And we can't stop here without being seen." "Then we go through," Maria replied. Fast. She had noticed something that David had missed. The rail line didn't stop at the mining complex. It continued through the valley and up the slope on the other side, probably connecting to yet another operation further up the mountain. If they could maintain their speed and avoid detection, they might be able to pass through the complex without anyone realizing what was happening. "Are you insane?" David asked. "There are at least 30 men down there, And they're all armed. If they see us, we're dead. If they see us, we're dead. Maria agreed. So let's make sure they don't see us. The track curved to the left as it approached the valley, and Maria realized that most of the men below were working inside buildings, or focusing on equipment that faced away from the rail line. The track itself ran along the edge of the complex, designed to be as unobtrusive as possible, so that car traffic wouldn't interfere with the mining operations. They were committed now anyway. The cart was moving too fast to stop safely, and jumping off would probably result in serious injuries that would leave them stranded and helpless. Their only option was to ride it out and hope that speed and darkness would be enough to get them through undetected. As they rolled through the valley, Maria could see details of Miguel's operation that made her understand just how massive his criminal enterprise really was. This wasn't just a mining operation, it was a complete manufacturing facility. She could see buildings that were obviously processing drugs, others that looked like weapon storage, and what appeared to be a garage full of stolen vehicles being stripped for parts. This is why the government couldn't stop him, David whispered as they passed through the complex. He's not just running a human trafficking operation or even a drug business. He's built an entire shadow economy up here in the mountains, complete with supply chains, manufacturing, and distribution networks. Taking down Miguel would require a military operation, not just a police raid. They were halfway through the valley when their luck ran out. A man carrying a flashlight emerged from one of the buildings just as their cart was passing by, and the beam of his light caught them directly. For a moment, all three of them froze. The guard trying to understand what he was seeing. Maria and David trying to decide whether to duck down or attempt to look like they belonged there. Then the guard began shouting in Spanish, raising an alarm that brought men running from every direction. Gunshots echoed through the valley as Miguel's men opened fire on the moving cart, but they were shooting at a target that was already disappearing into the darkness on the far side of the complex. "Hold on!" David shouted over the noise of bullets ricocheting off the rails behind them. "This track goes uphill from here, but if we can maintain our speed, we should be able to stay ahead of anyone trying to follow us on foot." The cart began to slow as it climbed the slope on the far side of the valley, but it was still moving faster than a person could run. Behind them, they could hear engines starting as Miguel's men organized a pursuit using vehicles, but the rail line led into terrain that would be difficult for trucks or motorcycles to navigate. "How long can we keep this up?" Maria asked as bullets continued to fly around them. "I don't know," David admitted. "But we're going to find out." The track curved back and forth as it climbed higher into the mountains, and the cart began to slow significantly as the grade became steeper. They could still hear pursuit behind them, but the sounds were getting fainter, suggesting that either their pursuers were falling behind or giving up the chase. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached another level section of track where the cart's speed stabilized. They were now high enough in the mountains that the air was noticeably thinner and colder, and they could see the lights of the valley far below them.
"Look," Maria pointed ahead.
"There's something up there." In the distance, they could see lights that didn't belong to any mining operation. Steady, white lights that looked like they came from a legitimate settlement, or perhaps a highway. For the first time since escaping from the collapsed mine, they allowed themselves to hope that they might actually reach safety. But just as they were beginning to relax, they heard a sound that made their blood freeze, the whistle of another minecart approaching from behind them on the same track. "They're following us," David said, looking back into the darkness, "and they're catching up." The pursuing cart was moving faster than theirs, probably because it was carrying fewer people and being operated by someone who knew the track better. They could hear Miguel's voice carried on the wind, shouting orders to the men with him. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they overtake us," David calculated. "And when they do, we're going to be trapped on this cart with nowhere to run." Maria looked around desperately, trying to find some option they hadn't considered. That's when she noticed something about the track itself. It was approaching a section where the rail line split into two branches, one continuing straight ahead and the other veering off toward what looked like an abandoned mining operation. "David," she said, "do you know how to operate a manual track switch?" "I think so," he replied. "But why would we want to change direction? We don't know where that other track goes." "We don't want to change our direction," Maria explained. "We want to change theirs." She was already climbing out of the moving cart toward the manual lever that controlled the track switch. If she could pull the lever at exactly the right moment, the pursuing cart would be diverted onto the abandoned track while their cart continued toward the lights ahead. It was dangerous, potentially suicidal, and required timing that would have to be perfect. But it was their only chance to escape from Miguel once and for all. The pursuing cart was getting closer, and they could hear Miguel screaming threats that echoed off the mountain slopes. Maria positioned herself at the track switch, waiting for the exact moment when their cart had passed the junction, but Miguel's cart hadn't reached it yet. "Maria," David called out, "whatever you're going to do it now." She pulled the lever with all her strength, and the track switch moved just as Miguel's cart reached the junction. In the darkness behind them, they heard the screech of metal on metal, followed by shouts of confusion and anger, as Miguel and his men found themselves speeding toward an abandoned mine instead of continuing their pursuit. But their relief was short-lived. As Maria climbed back into their cart, she noticed that the lights ahead of them weren't getting closer anymore. In fact, they seemed to be moving away. "David," she said, "I think we have a problem." The lights ahead weren't stationary buildings or highway markers as they had hoped. They were the headlights of vehicles moving along a distant road, and the road was running parallel to their track rather than intersecting with it. Worse, their cart was beginning to slow dramatically as it climbed toward what appeared to be the highest point on the rail line. "We're going to run out of momentum," David realized, checking the grade of the track ahead. "This section climbs another 200 meters, and we're already losing speed." He was right. The cart that had been carrying them swiftly away from Miguel's operation was now barely moving, and with each meter they climbed, their speed decreased further. Soon they would be sitting motionless on an exposed section of track, visible to anyone who came looking for them. But that wasn't their biggest problem. As the cart slowed and David had a chance to examine it more carefully, he discovered something that made their situation far more desperate than either of them had realized. "Maria," he said quietly, "look at the brake system." She followed his gaze and saw what he had noticed. The brake mechanism was damaged, probably from one of the bullets that had been fired at them during their escape through the valley. The metal housing was cracked and leaking hydraulic fluid, which meant they had no way to control their speed when the track began to descend again. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she could guess the answer from David's expression. "Bad," he replied. "When we reach the top of this grade and start going downhill, we're going to accelerate whether we want to or not. And without brakes, we'll keep accelerating until we either derail, hit something, or reach the end of the line." Maria looked ahead at the track disappearing into the darkness and tried to calculate their options. They could jump from the cart while it was still moving slowly, but that would leave them stranded in the mountains without supplies, shelter, or any clear route to safety. They could try to repair the brake system, but neither of them had the tools or expertise needed for that kind of mechanical work. Or they could ride the cart to whatever destination lay ahead and hope that luck would carry them through one more impossible situation. "Where does this track go?" she asked. "It has to connect to something. Another mining operation, a loading facility, maybe a connection to the main railroad system." David pulled out a topographic map from his backpack and tried to match their current location with the terrain features visible in the moonlight. "According to this, we're heading toward the old Atacama copper mine. It was a major operation until the 1970s, when declining ore prices forced it to shut down. So we're heading toward another abandoned mine?" "Not exactly," David said, studying the map more carefully. "The Atacama mine was connected to the national railway system. When it was operational, trains carried copper ore from here to processing facilities in Antofagasta and other coastal cities. If that connection still exists, this track might actually lead us to safety." Their cart reached the highest point on the rail line and paused for a moment, balanced between the upward climb they had just completed and the downward slope that lay ahead. For a few seconds they could see their situation clearly. Behind them, the lights of Miguel's various operations scattered through the valleys, and ahead of them, a rail line that disappeared into darkness toward an uncertain destination. Then gravity took over, and they began to descend. The acceleration was gradual at first, but as the grade became steeper, their speed increased rapidly. Without functioning brakes, they were completely at the mercy of physics and whatever obstacles might be waiting on the track ahead. "This is insane," David muttered, gripping the sides of the cart as it rattled over increasingly rough rails. "We're riding a runaway mine cart through mountains we don't know, toward a destination we can't see, hoping to reach an abandoned railroad connection that might not even exist anymore." "When you put it like that, it does sound pretty crazy," Maria agreed. "But it's still better than being married to Carlos in an underground prison." Despite everything they had been through and everything they still faced, David found himself smiling at that response. Maria Santos was either the bravest woman he had ever met or the most reckless, and at this point, the distinction didn't seem to matter much. The track curved sharply to the left as it descended, and their cart leaned precariously as it took the turn at a speed that was probably well beyond what the old rails were designed to handle. They could hear metal groaning under the stress, and David began to worry that the track itself might give way before they reached whatever destination lay ahead. "David," Maria said, pointing into the darkness ahead. "What is that?" He followed her gaze and saw what appeared to be a large structure blocking their path, a building or facility that had been constructed directly over the rail line. As they got closer, he realized it was a loading station, probably where the original Atacama mine had transferred copper ore from mine carts to full-sized railroad cars. "We're going to crash into it," Maria said, stating the obvious. "Not necessarily," David replied, though his voice carried more hope than confidence. "Loading stations are designed to allow carts to pass through. There should be openings that let the track continue." Their cart was now moving fast enough that the wind made it difficult to talk, and the rattling of the wheels over loose rail joints created a constant percussion that drowned out all other sounds. They were committed to whatever lay ahead. At their current speed, jumping from the cart would be suicide, and there was no way to steer or stop. The loading station loomed larger as they approached, and they could see that it was indeed designed to allow carts to pass through. But they could also see that the building was partially collapsed, with debris scattered across the tracks and hanging from the ceiling structure. "Get down," David shouted, and they both pressed themselves flat against the floor of the cart just as they plunged into the darkness of the damaged building. The next 30 seconds were a chaos of flying debris sparking metal, and the deafening sound of their cart smashing through obstacles that had been blocking the track for decades. Something heavy crashed down onto the cart just behind them, and they could smell smoke and hot metal as friction generated sparks that illuminated the destruction around them. Then they were through, emerging from the far side of the loading station into open air that felt miraculous after the claustrophobic terror of the collapsed building. Their cart was still moving, still accelerating down the mountain slope, but it was also making new noises that suggested the collision had caused significant damage. "Are you hurt?" David asked, checking Maria for injuries. "I don't think so," she replied, though her voice was shaky. "But look at the cart." The front section had been smashed by falling debris, and one of the wheels was making a grinding noise that indicated damage to the axle or bearings. Worse, there was now a visible crack running along the bottom of the cart that seemed to be getting longer with each bump and vibration. "How much farther to the railroad connection?" Maria asked. David tried to read his map in the uncertain light, but it was difficult to determine their exact position after passing through the loading station. "I think we're close," he said. "Maybe another kilometer or two." They were moving fast enough now that a kilometer would pass in just a few minutes, but those might be the longest minutes of their lives. The damaged cart was becoming increasingly unstable, and the cracking sound from the bottom was getting louder and more frequent. As they rounded another curve, they suddenly saw lights ahead, not the moving lights of vehicles on a distant road, but the steady illumination of what appeared to be a working railroad yard. There were buildings, signal lights, and most importantly, the parallel lines of a main railway track that stretched away in both directions. "We made it," Maria said, hardly believing their luck. But their relief was premature. As they got closer to the railroad yard, they could see that their track didn't simply connect to the main line. It ended at a barrier designed to prevent unauthorized access. They were going to crash into a concrete wall at high speed, with no brakes and no way to jump clear safely. "The cart's not going to survive that impact," David said, watching the barrier approach with the certainty of a mathematical equation. "Then we better not be in the cart when it hits," Maria replied. She was already calculating distances and timing, trying to determine when they would need to jump to avoid both the crash and the likelihood of serious injury from hitting the ground at high speed. It was going to require perfect timing and considerable luck, but it was their only option. "On my count," she said, positioning herself to leap from the side of the cart. 3, 2, but before she could reach 1, the crack in the bottom of the cart finally gave way completely. The floor split apart with a sound like thunder, and suddenly they weren't riding in a minecart anymore. They were clinging to 2 separate pieces of metal that were spinning and tumbling down the track toward the concrete barrier. David and Maria were thrown in different directions as the cart disintegrated around them. David managed to grab onto a section of the rail line and pull himself to safety just as the remains of their cart crashed into the barrier with an explosion of sparks and twisted metal. Maria wasn't as lucky. The piece of cart she was clinging to spun sideways and threw her clear of the track, but she landed hard on the rocky ground beside the rail line, rolling several times before coming to rest against a fence post that marked the boundary of the railroad yard. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the distant sound of settling metal from the crash site. Then David's voice cut through the darkness. "Maria, are you okay?" She tried to respond, but when she attempted to move, a sharp pain in her left ankle told her that something was definitely wrong. She had twisted or possibly broken something in the fall, which meant she was going to have difficulty walking just when they needed to move quickly to avoid discovery. "I'm alive," she called back, "but I think I'm hurt." David made his way carefully through the debris field to where Maria had landed. She was conscious and alert, but her ankle was already beginning to swell, and she was having trouble putting weight on it. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can try," she replied, though her expression suggested that walking was going to be extremely painful. They were at the edge of the railroad yard now, closer to safety than they had been since escaping from the collapsed mine, but they still faced the challenge of reaching actual help before Miguel's men tracked them down. The crash of their cart had created enough noise to wake anyone within a mile radius, and it would only be a matter of time before someone came to investigate. "There's a building over there with lights on." David pointed toward what appeared to be a railroad office or control station.
If we can reach that, we might be able to call for help.
"Assuming whoever's in there is willing to help two strangers who just crashed a minecart into their railroad yard," Maria added. "At this point," David said, helping her to her feet, "we don't have much choice but to trust someone." As they limped toward the lighted building, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows, a man who had been expecting them for hours and who was very interested in the story they would have to tell. The man watching them from the shadows stepped forward into the light, and Maria's heart nearly stopped when she saw he was wearing a military uniform. After everything they had been through, the possibility that they had stumbled into another trap seemed almost too cruel to bear. "Senor Chen," the man said in accented English, addressing David directly. "We have been waiting for you." David froze, uncertain whether this was rescue or capture. "How do you know my name?" "Because 3 hours ago, we received a satellite transmission from your seismic equipment," the officer replied. "The signal indicated that a government scientist was in distress in this area, and we have been monitoring all possible escape routes since then. The man was Colonel Roberto Vasquez of the Chilean army, and his presence at the railroad yard wasn't a coincidence." David's seismic monitoring equipment had been fitted with an emergency beacon that activated automatically when it detected certain patterns of geological activity. When the earthquake had triggered the beacon, it had alerted military authorities that a government researcher was potentially in danger in a remote area known to be associated with illegal mining operations. "Is it really over?" Maria asked, hardly daring to believe that they had finally reached safety. "For you, yes," Colonel Vasquez replied. "But I'm afraid this is just the beginning for the investigation into Miguel Mendoza's operations." Within an hour, the railroad yard was filled with military vehicles, medical personnel, and investigators from multiple government agencies. Maria's ankle was treated by a military medic who determined that it was severely sprained but not broken, while David was debriefed by intelligence officers who were very interested in the details of Miguel's underground complex. "The earthquake you predicted was perfect timing," Colonel Vasquez told David, as they watched investigators photograph the remains of their minecart. "When the main mine collapsed, it trapped most of Miguel's men underground. The few who escaped were disorganized and desperate, which made them easy to track and capture." "What about Miguel himself?" Maria asked. "He was found 3 hours ago at the abandoned mine where your track switch sent his cart," the colonel replied. "Apparently, the old mining operation he ended up in was structurally unsound, and the weight of his cart caused a partial collapse that trapped him until our search teams could dig him out." Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. She was relieved that Miguel could never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her, but she also felt a strange sadness for the man who had built such an elaborate criminal empire only to see it destroyed by forces beyond his control. "What happens now?" David asked. "I assume there's going to be a long investigation, trials, testimony." "There will be," Colonel Vasquez agreed. "But you've both been through enough trauma for now. The government is prepared to offer you protection, new identities if necessary, and assistance in rebuilding your lives wherever you choose to settle." Over the next several days, as Maria recovered from her injuries in a military hospital, the full scope of Miguel's operation became clear. The investigation revealed that he had been running a network of illegal mines throughout northern Chile, involving human trafficking, drug manufacturing, weapons smuggling, and money laundering, on a scale that shocked even experienced investigators. Rosa, the broken woman who had tried to prepare Maria for marriage to Carlos, was found alive in the ruins of the main mine, along with 2 of the other women who had been held captive. The psychological damage they had suffered would take years to heal, but at least they were free to begin that healing process. Carlos Mendoza's body was recovered from the tunnel collapse that David had triggered with his seismic equipment. Maria felt no satisfaction at his death, only a sense of closure that the man who had planned to force her into marriage would never have the opportunity to hurt another woman. 3 weeks after their escape, Maria and David sat in a cafe in Santiago, planning their futures as free people. The government had offered them both new positions, David as a senior seismologist with expanded authority to investigate geological hazards in remote areas, and Maria as a consultant for a new program designed to help victims of human trafficking reintegrate into society. "I keep thinking about that moment in the tunnel when you first told me about the earthquake," Maria said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't been brave enough to risk everything for a stranger, you would have found another way." David interrupted. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived 3 weeks in hell, figured out an escape plan that saved both our lives, and never gave up hope even when everything seemed impossible."
"We saved each other," Maria replied. "That's what partners do." The word partners hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to discuss directly.
Their relationship had been forged in extraordinary circumstances, and they both understood that what happened next would need to develop naturally, without the pressure of shared trauma forcing decisions they weren't ready to make. "I've been thinking about going back to my family's farm," Maria said. "With my father's gambling debts paid by the government as part of the restitution program, I could actually make it work. Maybe grow something other than potatoes for once." "That sounds wonderful," David replied, "and it's only about 2 hours from the new seismic monitoring station they want me to establish in that region." Maria smiled at the transparency of that comment. "How convenient." "Isn't it?" David agreed, not bothering to hide his own smile. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood in the fields of her family's farm, watching the sun rise over the mountains where she had once been held captive. The farm was thriving under her management, with new crops that brought better prices than the old staples, and a small guest house that provided supplementary income from tourists interested in authentic rural experiences. David Chen visited every weekend officially to check on seismic monitoring equipment he had installed throughout the region, but really to help with farm work and to continue a courtship that had begun in the darkness of an underground mine and was now blooming in the sunlight of freedom. They had both been changed by their experiences in ways that would never fully heal, but they had also discovered reserves of courage, resourcefulness, and capacity for love that they had never known they possessed. Their story had become local legend, told and retold in the villages throughout northern Chile as an example of how love could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. Maria's father had returned from Santiago, sober for the first time in years, and determined to make amends for the choice that had nearly destroyed his daughter's life. He worked alongside Maria in the fields every day, asking no forgiveness and making no excuses, simply trying to prove through his actions that he was worthy of being part of her new life. On a warm evening in late spring, as Maria and David sat on the porch of the farmhouse watching the stars appear in the clear mountain sky, she asked him the question that had been on her mind for months. "Do you think we would have found each other if none of this had happened? If we had just met at a cafe in Santiago or been introduced by friends?" David considered the question carefully. "I think we would have been attracted to each other," he said, "but I don't think we would have recognized how well matched we are. It took extreme circumstances to show us what we're both capable of." "So you're saying we needed to steal a minecart and survive an earthquake to figure out we're compatible?" Maria asked, laughing. "I'm saying that most people never get tested the way we were tested," David replied. "Most couples have to guess whether their partner will stand by them when things get difficult. We already know." As if to emphasize his point, a small tremor shook the ground beneath their feet. Nothing dangerous, just a reminder that the earth was always moving, always changing, and that the stability they had built together was something they had created, rather than something they could take for granted. "Another earthquake?" Maria asked, though she wasn't concerned. David's monitoring equipment would warn them long before any seismic activity became dangerous. "Just a small one," David confirmed, checking the readings on his portable seismograph. "The mountain is settling into a new configuration. It happens sometimes after major geological events." Maria stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking toward the mountains where Miguel's collapsed mine lay buried under tons of rock. Sometimes she still had nightmares about the underground tunnels and the sound of Carlos's voice echoing through the darkness, but those memories were being replaced by new experiences. The satisfaction of successful harvests, the joy of rebuilding relationships with her brothers who had returned from Santiago to help with the farm, and the quiet happiness of falling in love with someone who had risked everything to save her. "Maria," David said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She turned to face him and saw that he was holding a small box in his hands. Not an expensive jewelry box, but something handmade from wood that had been polished until it glowed in the starlight. "I know we said we would let our relationship develop naturally," he continued. "But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with someone who is brave enough to steal a minecart, smart enough to operate a railroad switch in the dark, and strong enough to rebuild her entire world after it's been destroyed." When Maria opened the box, she found a ring that David had made himself from copper, not the copper mined by men like Miguel for criminal purposes, but copper from the legitimate mines where honest people worked to build honest lives. It was simple and beautiful, and it represented everything she valued about the man who had helped her escape from hell and who now wanted to share heaven with her. "Yes," she said, before he could finish asking the question. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes." They were married 6 months later in the small church in Maria's village, surrounded by family, friends, and several of the investigators and military personnel who had become friends during the long process of bringing Miguel's criminal organization to justice. Rosa was there, healthier and happier than anyone had thought possible, working as an advocate for other trafficking victims and serving as maid of honor for the woman whose escape had helped free them all. As Maria and David exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges life might bring, the bells of the church rang out across the valley where they had first found each other in the darkness. It was a sound of celebration, of hope fulfilled, and of new beginnings rising from the ashes of old endings. Their wedding reception was held in the farmyard, with tables made from wooden planks set on sawhorses and food prepared by every family in the village. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed freely, someone suggested that the bride and groom should tell the story of how they met. Maria and David looked at each other and smiled. It was a story they had told many times to investigators, journalists, and friends, but never to a room full of people who were celebrating their happiness rather than documenting their survival. "It began with an earthquake," Maria said, raising her glass to toast her new husband. "And it ended with everything we never knew we wanted." "2 earthquakes," David replied, touching his glass to hers. "And to the courage to grab everything you can when the ground starts shaking beneath your feet." As their guests raised their glasses in response to that toast, the sound echoed across the valley, like an answer to all the questions they had asked themselves during those desperate hours underground. They had escaped from the darkness, survived the impossible, and found love in the place where love seemed least likely to exist. The minecart they had stolen to win their freedom was gone, crushed and buried in the wreckage of their dramatic escape. But the courage and determination that had carried them to safety remained, stronger than ever, ready to face whatever new adventures their life together might bring. In the distance, the mountains stood silent, under the stars, keeping their secrets and holding their stories. Some of those stories were dark, full of greed and violence and people who disappeared without a trace. But some of them were bright, full of love and courage and second chances that seemed too good to be true. Maria and David's story was one of the bright ones, and as they danced together under the Chilean sky, surrounded by everyone who mattered to them, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way they had faced everything else, together, with complete trust in each other and absolute determination to never give up hope. The earthquake that had destroyed Miguel's underground empire had also created the foundation for their new life together. From the collapse of one world, they had built another, better world, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most impossible circumstances. As the celebration continued around them, Maria whispered in David's ear, "Do you think we'll ever have a normal, quiet life?" David laughed and spun her around in his arms. "I hope not," he replied. "Normal and quiet are overrated. I'd rather have extraordinary and complicated with you than simple and safe with anyone else." "Good answer," Maria said, kissing him as the church bells rang midnight and their first day as husband and wife officially began. "Because I think extraordinary and complicated might be exactly what we're getting." They were right about that, but they were also right about everything else. Their capacity to handle whatever came their way, their commitment to protecting each other and the people they loved, and their faith that no matter how dark things might become, there was always a way to find light if you were brave enough to keep looking for it. The story of the captive bride and the collapsing minecart had ended, but the story of Maria and David Chen was just beginning. And if their past was any indication, it was going to be an incredible adventure.